Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for joining us. I would like to discuss an emotion that we don't usually talk about, yet this emotion can unleash a surge of positive energy into our hearts. This emotion can literally lift our spirits above the clouds. This emotion is anticipation, that absolutely euphoric, sensational, overwhelming feeling we have when we just can't wait another moment for something that we've been longing for. Oh, baby. We've all experienced it, from our very first day in school. Remember those days? To taking a test, to going on our first date, to the time leading up to our wedding, to the months before our child is born. I even remember back in the 1970s, a ketchup commercial which managed to vividly capture the sensation. The year was 1979. The classic Heinz ad featured two little boys squeezing a bottle of ketchup and just waiting and waiting and waiting for that ketchup to pour out onto their burgers. But what made this advertisement on television so amazing, what made it unforgettable, was that the ad was set to the song Anticipation. It's making me wait. Hey, Google it. For some of you, it's history. For others, it will be a new discovery. I can remember anticipation. It's making me wait. Oh, this commercial was just unforgettable. And then at the end of the commercial, the voiceover stated this: thick, rich, Heinz ketchup. It's worth the wait. Wait a minute. This story gets better. As we know, or many of us know, the song used in the ad, titled Anticipation, was performed by Carly Simon. Just for kicks and giggles, that song climbed years earlier into the Billboard charts, peaking at number 13. It became one of Carly Simon's biggest hits. In fact, Carly received a Grammy nomination for Best Pop Female Vocalist for the song Anticipation. But this is what you might not know. This is pretty funny. Carly Simon wrote that song in 15 minutes. She wrote that song in 15 minutes as she awaited singer Cat Stevens to pick her up for a date. Anticipation. It's making me wait. I love that story. Now, as we know, there's a downside to anticipation, a negative side to anticipation. Negative anticipation is just as much a part of life as the positive aspects. The waiting can produce worry, fear, anxiety, stress, even depression. Friends, I'm sure many of you have experienced this just like I have. Some of you may even be experiencing it at this very moment. You know, you're anticipating a doctor's diagnosis, or anticipating an impending divorce, or anticipating the day a loved one leaves for a long journey. Mental health experts say the power of our imagination can be a destructive thing at times. Our tendency is to go to the worst case scenario, and this causes us to lose perspective. This causes us to lose optimism and hopefulness. Let me pause right there and share something. The worst case scenario can cause us to lose perspective. I remember on the worst day of my life, standing in that funeral home, looking into the casket of my first wife, Trina, clutching the hands of our two little boys. And I looked at my father and I said, Dad, I've lost hope. And my father responded, you can't lose something God gave you, son. You haven't lost hope. You've lost perspective. Now, son, just stand. I want to just remind many of you who are at the end of your rope. You haven't lost hope. You've lost perspective, because that's our tendency in a bad situation. Just remember, you haven't lost hope. The battle is not over. You may have lost perspective, but guess what? You can regain perspective. That's why I say that these negative aspects of anticipation can be so destructive. These negative thought patterns cause us to attract what we don't want in our lives, rather than working to manifest what we actually want to see in our lives. So the question becomes, how do we cope with what experts call anticipatory anxiety? First of all, I think we have to acknowledge it. We have to acknowledge that anxiety exists as a result of anticipation. And then we need to address the negative thoughts. And then the second thing we need to do is to force our brain to think about positive outcomes. So first, acknowledge that the anxiety does exist, and then force our brains to deal with the positive outcomes, to anticipate positive outcomes. I actually practiced this for years leading up to my first wife's passing. And I have to tell you, it helped tremendously. Trina was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1991. And like many of you have discovered, living in the neighborhood of uncertainty can be crippling. My emotions were all over the place. My heart was flooded with anxiety as the constant narrative of what if played in my mind on a continuous loop. And then it happened. I remember the day that I read a scripture that, truthfully, I had barely noticed before. It's a simple scripture. It's just one line. It's found in the wisdom of Solomon. It's in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7. Here it is. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. As a woman thinketh in her heart, so is she. It's one of the most profound statements in the Bible. You don't even have to believe in the Bible to understand the truth of this statement. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever talked yourself into having a bad day? Sure. But also, have you ever talked yourself into having a good day? You can actually think yourself into having a better day. One of the most amazing gifts we have, friends, is our mind. The human mind has the unique ability to think, to learn, to choose, and to reason. Just our thoughts can change the course of our lives. Our thoughts have the power to shape our reality, to adjust our emotional state and change our attitudes. Frank Outlaw, among others, I believe, said it best. Watch your thoughts, they determine your words. Watch your words, they determine your actions. Watch your actions, they determine your habits. Watch your habits, they shape your character. Watch your character. Your character determines your destiny. I began working on renewing my mind, slowly at first. Doctors tell us it's possible to actually rewire our minds. I experienced it beginning with that one scripture, as a man thinketh, so is he. So instead of constantly worrying about the what ifs, I began, albeit slowly, focusing on what we have. At the time, what we had was that moment, the present. Things slowly began changing for me. Yes, the reality was daunting, and it was in front of our face. There was chemo, doctor's visits, long periods of sickness for Trina, canceled trips and events. But guess what? There were also things that we could anticipate. Picnics, road trips, times of unbridled laughter, precious family moments that today are your treasure. You might say, but Rick, didn't your wife pass away? Yes, she did. But during those 6 years, not all of my thoughts were negative. As a matter of fact, the majority of my thoughts anticipated better days, good outcomes, and there were many. Friends, our thinking determines whether our outcomes are successful. Our thinking determines how productive we will be. Our thinking even determines our peace and our joy, our mental health. Every action begins with a thought. Every outcome begins with a thought. So, what if? What if we could shift our thoughts to produce more positive actions? The good news is we can. Dr. Catherine Sanderson explores the emerging field of positive psychology, which examines the factors that can determine physical and psychological well-being. My favorite section of her book, and I mentioned this in an earlier podcast, my favorite section of her book is a chapter titled, Older Adults Are Wise, Not Forgetful. I think I like this because I'm an older adult. But Sanderson says life is about how we think. Even getting older can be framed based on how we think. She shares this hilarious story about losing her suitcase. She simply forgot it as she's preparing for a speaking engagement. And she didn't realize this until she had left the house, called back home. And her husband said, yep, your suitcase is here. So she's got this new plan. She's going to arrive at the hotel, find a Walmart early the next morning. She finds a Miley Cyrus suitcase. And at lunch, her colleagues are laughing at her. And they blame it on the fact that she has too much on her plate. And Sanderson argues back, if this would have happened to someone that was in their 60s or 70s or 80s, we'd call it a senior moment. But let me tell you something, colleagues. If it happened to a college student who loses his ID and his keys and his cell phone on a regular basis, we wouldn't think anything about it. Here was her point. Our thinking impacts every area of our lives, even how we frame our lives and how we define those frames. Friends, I began reframing my thinking to expect better outcomes each day, even during a time of crisis. And would you believe I began anticipating events and actually watching those events take place and experiencing joy and peace in the middle of hell? If you're willing to try, I want to tell you your brain is capable of the heavy lifting. I've got to continue this discussion in a future podcast that I'm going to title, What Else? Anticipation 2.0. I sure hope you join me. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, this is Dr. Rick asking the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is the podcastfactory.com.